What an impact that was!
As if Mark thought he was going to pull to the left of Kovalainen, and Kovalainen started to get out of his way.
Geez, I did 3 days of driving and I couldn't hold my head up.
Formula One is a dangerous sport where drivers lay it all on the line to become the best. Unfortunately, things often go wrong.
This is the accident. Oh, and it was the merest of touches, but it was enough. And look how the wheel has come loose.
When things work out, the payoff is exhilarating and makes for some of the best highlight reels.
Has that inside line, Perez goes off the track, cuts the chicane, off goes Leclerc, through goes Hamilton!
However, determining the risk versus reward is something only the best in the business can do. A single lapse in judgment can make the difference between life and death. These are the most terrifying F1 crashes of all time. The 2009 Formula One season will forever be remembered. The return of Ross Brawn and a new team, Brawn GP, quickly demonstrated why he is one of the best in the business. The team would go on to dominate the early rounds, which ultimately set up Jenson Button for his maiden Drivers' Championship. However, the Hungarian Grand Prix sent shockwaves through the paddock and the F1 community in a race that was dominated by personal records and milestone achievements. The unthinkable happened.
As imagens do acidente foram claras.
As qualifying got underway, the Tifosi were finally catching up to rivals Brawn, but in a moment of pure horror, a spring detached from the Brawn of Rubens Barrichello. After bouncing along the track, it struck Felipe Massa's helmet at a speed exceeding 150 miles per hour, or 250 kilometers an hour. Massa immediately lost consciousness, becoming a passenger in the Ferrari. He went straight on through the corner, finally coming to a stop at the tyre barrier. Fortunately, the Ferrari driver survived the ordeal and spent 9 days in hospital. Felipe Massa ultimately missed the rest of the season, only returning the following year. Massa was lucky during the incident, a kind of luck that our next driver never had. Parabolica is one of the fastest corners on the F1 calendar, with drivers carrying exceptional speeds onto the main straight. During the 1970 Formula One season, this notorious corner would sadly claim the life of Jochen Rindt. Known for its high speeds, Monza is correctly named the Temple of Speed. Its layout allows drivers to slipstream each other, gaining a few miles per hour on the straights. Due to this phenomenon, teams always try to maximise their top speed by running smaller rear wings. The main idea is to reduce as much drag as possible and add even more top-end speed to the car. For the 1970 Italian Grand Prix, Lotus and Rindt chose to completely drop the rear wing. This was despite Lotus teammate John Miles reporting the car to have no stability on the straights. The following day, Rindt ran much higher gear ratios than his competitors, ideally looking to capitalise on this extra speed. In fact, the car should have easily reached speeds exceeding 200 miles an hour. But tragedy struck just 5 laps into practice when Rindt crashed heavily on the infamous Parabolica corner, smashing the front half of his car. He sadly lost his life and was pronounced dead en route to hospital. For the next moment, we move just a few years forward from the Rindt incident to the legend himself, Niki Lauda, and the historic 1976 season.
He was able to get in, undo the belts. I was on top of the car, and I grabbed Niki's shoulders and pulled him out of the car.
Back in the 1970s, Formula One was all about speed and breaking records. Safety was merely an afterthought. However, this came back to bite the FIA at the infamous Nürburgring. During the 1976 German Grand Prix, Niki Lauda was showing incredible pace, being the fastest driver on track during the earlier sessions. However, early on during the race was where everything Lauda had warned the race organisers about became reality. It was the second lap of this coveted race that sent the paddock into disarray. Lauda was in the lead through the very fast kink before Bergwerk. His Ferrari swerved off the track, colliding with the embankment and bursting into flames. While accidents like this were common in the 1970s, the problem was that Lauda was trapped in his car. Numerous drivers stopped near the incident and rushed to save the Austrian. Even though Arturo Mazzario pulled him from his car, the damage was already done. Niki Lauda had suffered severe burns to his head and hands, but it was the toxic gas he inhaled that damaged his lungs and blood. By what can only be described as a miracle, Lauda survived the ordeal, losing most of his right ear and having lasting burns to his face. Shockingly enough, Lauda only missed 2 races, but ultimately lost the Drivers' Championship to James Hunt and McLaren. A few decades later, another massive presence in the paddock almost lost his life. Albert Park is notorious for its unique street circuit layout. It has served as the opener for the Formula One season on many occasions. Even though its position on the calendar was later moved to open the door for the Bahrain International Circuit, it is still a beloved track by drivers and fans. However, during the 2016 Formula One season, fans would once again see an F1 car flying after making contact, but this time it was not Mark Webber, but the master himself, Fernando Alonso. On lap 17, Alonso was tucked up behind Gutierrez in Haas's first ever competitive race. Unfortunately, Albert Park doesn't have a plethora of overtaking opportunities, so Alonso was going nowhere quickly. As the Spaniard tried to get past, his reaction time was a bit slower than usual. Even though many believed Gutierrez to be too early on the brakes, Alonso collected the rear of the Haas, which sent him flying into the wall at such an angle that no speed was able to bleed off. The McLaren MP431 somersaulted through the vertical as it disintegrated, creating a heart-stopping moment for fans. The car finally came to a rest, allowing Alonso to climb out, but he was lucky to have escaped with his life. Refueling F1 cars has been a topic debated about for decades. In fact, it was the norm up until the 2010 season. Once it was banned, many thought that it would kill the sport, removing some of the tactics teams could use to create a performance offset. By turning the clock back to the 1994 season, it is clear why refueling should have been banned earlier. In what should have been a normal pit stop for Max's dad, Jos Verstappen, driving for Benetton at the time, the unthinkable happened. As the car entered the pits, the fuel hose was connected. Now, for some context, this was nothing new, and teams had been doing it for years. However, on this day, disaster struck when the fuel hose wasn't correctly fixed to the car.
Right, there was the replay there. Now, when the nozzle came out of that was supposed to seal it. The fuel splashed, and see how 3 seconds later, that tremendous inferno there.
This led to petrol spraying from the hose and landing on a searing hot Benetton. Rudimentary physics took over as the car ignited. The whole incident was caught on live television, sparking many questions about what happened. It was great to see Jos Verstappen survive the ordeal, and had he not, it might have been the only way Lewis Hamilton could have won the 2021 Drivers' Championship. But no one can mimic the incredible pace Lewis showed at Spa in 2020, a track that has a long and often sad history. The Belgian Grand Prix is one of the highlights of the Formula One calendar. It's only 44 laps, but even though it might seem shorter, it has delivered year after year, and not always good memories. One such incident was the crash of Antoine Hubert, who collided with the barriers during the 2019 F2 race. He tragically lost his life.
I had no idea what had happened to Jackie, but another 2 wives, one sort of drowned about half a bottle of whiskey, one went hysterical because they had no idea what happened.
Years back in 1966, another F1 legend, Jackie Stewart, found himself in the same corner. However, back in the 1960s, Formula One didn't have the modern safety barriers we see today. Driving at around 165 miles an hour, 266 kilometers an hour, the British driver lost control of his car, smashing into a telephone pole and a farmer's shed. Stewart would come to a stop in a farmer's outbuilding with his car upside down and fuel dripping down his face. He was finally extricated by fellow drivers Graham Hill and Bob Bondurant, who both also crashed nearby. With no medical staff or doctors at the track, he was simply put in the bed of a pickup truck. Stewart would go on to become a big advocate for racing safety. Here is what he had to say. "If I have any legacy to leave the sport, I hope it will be seen to be an area of safety, because when I arrived in Grand Prix racing, so-called precautions and safety measures were diabolical." F1 race driver and now commentator Martin Brundle is perhaps one of the most recognised voices on F1 television. He is famously known for not being a top star driver, and Eddie Jordan made this clear after Brundle left the British team. But many might have forgotten about the 1996 season, and more specifically the opening race. With drivers all preparing for the season opener, excitement was paramount. Unfortunately for Brundle, excitement was rather short-lived when he had a monster shunt at turn 3. Brundle's Jordan took into the air, flying over a McLaren before flipping and landing upside down, rolling through the gravel trap. The car literally split in two as it folded on top of itself. Brundle would leave the incident unharmed, but it would show just how fragile these cars are when taking contact. Just 3 years later, brake problems would strike one of the legends of the sport. Michael Schumacher is not known for horrific crashes. In fact, the 7-time world champion had a unique ability to avoid them altogether. Unfortunately, the 1999 British Grand Prix would be something even the great German could not avoid.
マシンなのか、それともドライバーのミスなのか。
In scenes reminiscent of the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix, he smashed into the barriers after coming off the hangar straight. Schumacher was battling teammate Eddie Irvine at the time, but a rear brake failure sent him straight into the barriers. The incident would have large ramifications down the paddock. Michael missed the next 6 races due to a broken leg, completely handing the title to rival Mika Hakkinen. But the German would rebound, returning for the Malaysian Grand Prix, where he set the track on fire, often toying with some of his rivals, finishing second to teammate Irvine. While Schumacher's crash was no fault of his own, the next driver on our list is solely to blame for his incident. With the current F1 qualifying format, it's not uncommon to see drivers pushing the limits through every session. A track like Singapore notoriously ramps up in pace as more rubber is laid down on the track. With Lance Stroll trying to prove that he deserves his current seat, the Canadian was pushing the limits during Q2.
He gets wide on the first part, so it's a 2-part apex corner, 18 and 19, and he gets just fractionally too wide through 18.
However, he suffered a snap of oversteer, sending his Aston over the curbs at the final corner. This completely unsettled the Aston Martin, sending the Canadian into the barriers approaching the main straight. Not only did the car suffer millions of dollars worth of damage, but Stroll would miss the race the following day. He managed to get out of the car unaided and was later cleared by medical staff. What was left on the track was a broken Aston Martin and a frustrated Stroll, signifying that the crash might have looked worse than it really was. Ultimately, Carlos Sainz won the race, marking the only race of the 2023 calendar season not won by a Red Bull driver. But just because a driver survived doesn't mean they're always fine. What happened during the 2020 Bahrain Grand Prix was spine-tingling, to say the least. By the time the calendar headed to Bahrain, Lewis Hamilton had already wrapped up his 7th world title. This didn't mean that there was less intensity for the final few races of the season, however. Romain Grosjean, driving for Haas at the time, didn't have a competitive car. He was often found lurking around as a backmarker, but being his final season, the Frenchman had a point to prove. The race started like any other, with a formation lap. As the cars lined up on the grid, the ferocious battle up front was brewing. The usual protagonists were battling for P1. At the back of the grid, Grosjean was hoping to have a better race. Once the line of cars had filed through the first few turns, it seemed like a clean getaway. But just a few seconds into the race, Grosjean lost control of his Haas, smashing into the barriers at more than 120 miles an hour. Even more shocking is the fact that it took 28 seconds for Grosjean to free himself after being engulfed in flames. Upon impact, the car split in half, leaving the Frenchman with only a few seconds before it exploded. Quick thinking from the F1 medical team ultimately saved his life.
And a big fire there as as they exited out of turn 3, and that looks very nasty indeed, and unsurprisingly, that is a red flag.
This is still the hardest crash in F1 history that could be measured, even beating out the Hamilton shunt on Verstappen just a year later at Silverstone. As the great Ayrton Senna once said, if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you are no longer a racing driver. These are the risks the 20 best drivers in the world take. On many occasions it pays off, but when they don't, it could be fatal. Thank you for watching this video, and make sure to like and subscribe. Your support is what makes all these videos possible.